Have you ever had a client ask to have one of your engineers on site full-time or part-time? Or have you ever had a client where it would just be easier for everybody if you just put somebody out there for a part of the week or all of the week? Well, that's staff augmentation, and that's what we're going to cover today because as interesting as staff augmentation is, it can be quite the distraction if you're not prepared for it. My name is Adam Hanneman. Welcome to Ramblings of a Geek. I've been in the MSP space for the better part of the last couple of decades. I've been an augmentation engineer. I've led some augmentation engineers. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. So let's get into it today. Let's start off by talking about what augmentation is to make sure we're on the same page. In my book, augmentation is when you have an engineer on site dedicated to that client for at least some part of the week. Now, usually it's measured in day-long increments, right? Either it's 1 day or 5 days, somewhere in the middle. Augmentation is when it's easier for you, easier for the client, agreed upon between the two of you that you're just going to put your technician out there for a certain number of hours per week. It's just an ongoing thing. And you'll find that your augmentation engineer is a little bit like a mini account manager. They're on site more frequently than literally anybody else. They have a relationship with that client. And so you need them to have a little bit of a mini account manager type of capability and be able to manage that relationship on a day-to-day basis. And depending on the agreement, all of the issues might run through that engineer or they just work the issues that are going on. Some of the issues may go through the help desks or some sort of hybrid. And I think there's pros and cons to each one of them. And we'll get into the overall good, the bad, and the ugly for all of this stuff as we move into our conversation today. You'll find that staff augmentation is related to co-managed. And in fact, those two things might be the same thing for some clients depending on the nature of the agreement. So, this is one of those areas where you might do one, you might do the other, or you might do a combination of both. And I've seen it done all of the different ways. So let's head out on a ramble and we'll start covering pros and cons. So the first pro of all of this is usually there's a pretty good bucket of revenue that comes along with it because your augmentation clients are usually a little bit on the larger side. You're not going to put an augmentation engineer out for a 10-person company typically, right? It's usually a 30, 40, 50 or larger person company. So that's a pretty good bucket of revenue. The second piece is that you get some stickiness with this client because it's a little bit harder to replace you and an engineer that intimately knows your environment. So that you usually create a pretty good sized bucket of revenue, some good sized clients, and they're kind of sticky. Those are some really solid pros. On the flip side to the pros, there are some cons as well. The first one, and in my opinion, the most important one to think about and manage for, is the likelihood of staff burnout. When you are an augmentation engineer, oftentimes you feel like you're on an island, which can lead you to the idea that you can't take time off, you can't be out sick, you aren't really connected to the rest of the MSP, especially if your MSP has good company culture. So being alone on an island with the client can lead to some burnout. And when that burnout happens, you'll find that you have to then cross-train somebody else pretty quickly, especially if you haven't had somebody else kind of shadowing it all, because somebody else needs to learn that quickly. And if your tech gives you 2 weeks or maybe less of a notice, that can be a real sticky spot for you to be in. If a tech leaves, that's a problem because you have to train somebody else. But what happens if that client leaves? What happens if that client fires you for some reason? That's a big pile of revenue that you're going to have to deal with. So there's a potential pretty good size hit to your gross margin, and you might have to consider letting somebody go, which is not a thing that anybody wants to do. So know that these larger clients, especially if you have like one really big client and a bunch of littler clients, if this one really big client fires you, that can be quite impactful to you. So you have to be mindful of that. The final big con to think about is that these augmentation clients are often not in your target client profile. So if you are out there chasing clients that aren't part of your target client profile, it can set your team up for some challenges. So you want to make sure that you are trying to find as many target client profile clients as you possibly can, and you don't stumble into a ton of augmentation work. So we've talked about the good, the pros, the bad, the cons. Well, what about the ugly? The ugly is when you have a number of augmentation clients serviced by a number of augmentation engineers, and you've got multiple engineers that are kind of ready to kind of give it up all at the same time, right? You get 2 or 3 engineers that are like, you know what, I'm done. I want to be done with this augmentation stuff. That's a bad spot to be in, and I've been there before. So there are some things that I think you should pay attention to and think about as it relates to your augmentation practice. So if I'm going to build an augmentation practice today, there's a few things that I would want to do. The first thing is I would really want to build this practice deliberately. You really need to be in it or out of it. I don't think you want to stumble into too much staff augmentation. Now, most of the time what happens is a salesperson stumbles into an augmentation arrangement, you kind of don't turn it down because it's pretty good money, and it kind of just spirals from there. So if you're going to build an augmentation practice, build it, own it, do it well. How do you do that, right? The first thing is I would want to build some amount of rotation with my augmentation engineers. Best case, you have an N+1 engineer to clients, right? The idea here is that you have one extra augmentation engineer and you build a rotation. Now, I would probably have a primary engineer per client, but then I would rotate an engineer through on a pretty regular basis. And when they aren't rotating through to a client, rotate them back to the service desk and do a spot in the rotation for everybody to rotate back to the service desk and get a little bit of a break from their clients, see what's going on elsewhere in the organization, and make sure that they are fully involved in the culture as it relates to that. And as you build this rotation up, your engineers then can take a break. They can take a vacation because they got someone you can slide right in because you have this N+1. And if they're sick, you've got somebody else can help them out. Like those are ways that you can really alleviate some of that frustration and some of that like feeling like that client's world is on the technician's shoulders. If you can alleviate some of that or all of it, you're going to be in a pretty good spot. The second recommendation is to charge appropriately for the service. And this is one of those things where if you just kind of stumble into this, you might just be charging them for a typical managed services arrangement, which is fine at the beginning or the first time you kind of go through it, but you really want to make sure that you're getting paid appropriately for that technician's time. The challenge with all of this is that when you are doing full MSP across all of your clients, then your engineers are able to kind of work on whatever the most important thing is next across your entire client base. Well, if you're dedicating an engineer to a specific client for any number of hours during the week, it's pretty tough to have them work on other things while they're there. So it's forcing you to be a little bit less efficient, and that's not a great place for you to be. So the key here is you want to make sure you're charging your client at least 2.5 times, or if not 3 times, the engineer's burden salary for that time. If they're out there for the full week, you're charging them, somewhere between 2 and 3 times their salary for that augmentation piece of the agreement. And that might actually be in addition to a typical help desk arrangement with them too, right? So you want to make sure you're billing them appropriately because this is not a for free or just part of the MSP service. That's not going to scale well for you. If you're getting some value from this conversation, hit the like button. It really does help me out. And the last big thing that I would want to do here is standardize that ticket intake process. When I was doing my augmentation work, what I found would happen is that I would go on site for whatever client it was going to be. And I usually had 2 or 3 clients I was on site for in a given week. And I was usually kind of dedicated like Monday, Wednesday to client A, Tuesday, Thursday to client B, and Friday I kind of mixed it up between those 2 clients, or maybe I had a 3rd client. It sort of depended on the week. But for the most part, I was at a couple clients throughout the week. And so I'd show up and I'd have a list of tickets I was going to work on because it was things that I was either working on from before or there were new tickets that came into the help desk, and I would check in with the main contact. Main contact would go, here's your list of stuff I want you to work on today, which is entirely separate from what I was going to work on. Talk about frustrating. And so then I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I prioritize the stuff that I was going to work on versus the stuff that they wanted me to work on? And the client's not always right. So I had to work with the client to then prioritize what I was going to work on. And then I have to go back and do some administrative work to get that other list of things in as tickets for the ones that didn't already have tickets. So you really want to standardize this ticket intake process because it's really important. It will also just make things easier for your engineer. So standardize this ticket intake process. In my opinion, I think the best practice here is to have all of your client end users open tickets with the help desk like they would if they were not an augmentation client. Because then at least all the tickets get created. And then the engineer has the opportunity to work with the client to figure out what they're going to work on first, second, and third. But at least everything's captured in the system at that point, and there isn't this, flurry of post-it notes getting tossed at them when they walk in the door. When we think about the ticket intake process and those kinds of things, what do you do when someone stops by that augmentation engineer's desk and says, hey, tech, I need you to do a thing? Or when tech's walking the floor helping another user out and someone says, hey, come over here, I need you to do something for me. Like, what do you do about that? Because you want to make sure that you honor those types of requests because, of course, you are on site to kind of help them out with kind of all of the things. But you want to have some sanity in that process. So I think your best practice here is to say, you know what, I would love to help you. I'm working on something else real quick. Do me a favor, send an email quick into the help desk, and I'll loop by and I'll pick it up later. But that way you've at least started the paperwork for me. And most users are going to go, yeah, cool, I'll happily start the paperwork if it means you're going to stop by, right? And of course, the tech needs to stop by and need to manage their workload. I also think wherever possible, you want the tech to be able to either have a tablet on site with them or a mobile app on their phone to be able to kind of manage tickets as they're moving around the site. I mean, sure, they could take their laptop with them as well, but it's a little bit more cumbersome to do that. But especially if you're kind of up and moving around a lot, having some sort of device where you can update tickets and do those kinds of things is really helpful. When it comes to the overall kind of day, week, month at the client, I think it's a really good idea to have regular check-in meetings with whomever your primary contact is, because that primary contact is going to help you set prioritization. And if you've created the process to have all of their users create tickets when that technician isn't around, that primary contact shouldn't go, here's a big list of things. They might give you like one or two, because that is going to happen from time to time. But that primary contact conversation becomes more of a prioritization conversation than a here's a bunch of new work kind of conversation. So you want to have a regular ongoing meeting with that primary contact and check in and do those kinds of things. And then of course you're going to need your account manager to kind of come in and do the account management type of conversations as well. And your augmentation engineer should be part of those conversations. But you do want to have an account manager managing the account in addition to that primary augmentation engineer. So if you are deliberately finding augmentation type of clients, you're managing those clients well, you're helping out your engineers prevent the burnout, and you're creating the standards and processes to eliminate some of the chaos, I think you're going to be in a much better spot as it relates to augmentation work. So do that, do it well, and lean into it, and you're going to have a great relationship with your clients. Thanks for coming on this ramble with me, and I hope to see you on the next one.